ahead.
Okay, we're back to order here, and I was going to ask, how many are teachers in the group? We got quite a few. All right, I will hand it back to our moderator, who's going to get the rest of the panel all involved, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean.
Do you want some?
I told you we were going to go to Hannah, but I'm actually going to go, because we've got some questions, so I'm going to go to Reaver Bingham on this first question. Reaver, the question is, what is the difference between probation and parole? And if that leads you into talking about probation, I think it'd be perfect.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. In response to the question, what is the difference between probation and parole? Parole is a period of supervision after an individual has served whatever their sentence was in the state prison. So there's a period of supervised release, if you will, post the serving of their term in state prison. And parole is administered by the state. Probation in California is administered generally by the county, and it's a period of supervised release prior to or in lieu of a state prison sentence. So proceedings are suspended. The judge will put an individual on a period of probation, and if they successfully complete their period of probation, then the term is served, and there's no need to send the individual to state prison. So those are the basic differences. And as Judge Wesley indicated, when he gave the history of the criminal justice system, probation has that unique role of interacting with everyone within the criminal justice system, and we're involved from the time an individual gets arrested all the way through to sentencing and supervision. And from the very beginning, when an individual is arrested, our pretrial services division has a bail deviation division that will take a look at bail and can make a recommendation for bail increase or decrease. So we're involved at that point. We're involved in making own recognizances recommendation to the hearing officer, so an individual could get out on OR if accepted by the hearing officer. We run supervised release programs for individuals that are released pre-trial, and we also participate in the community-based alternatives to correction, wherein individuals on close sentence can be released on electronic monitoring. We work very closely with the Sheriff's Department in that regard as well. After an individual proceeds further in the judicial process, we are engaged in the investigation stage of the sentencing process. So when a case goes to the court for sentencing, and this can happen a pre-sentence report, a probation sentence investigation, or a post-sentence investigation, our officers are engaged in making recommendations. Well, first of all, providing information to the court by way of conducting an investigation relative to their past criminal history, their social ecology, any background information that is relevant to determining the sentence or informing the court as to how the case should be disposed of, and we'll make a recommendation to the court relative to the individual's eligibility for probation, and if granted probation, what the terms and conditions of probation should be. We also, once that's done, if an individual is granted probation, then we're also engaged in the process at supervision. So if an individual is granted probation, then they are referred to the probation department for supervision. We also provide reports to the court relative to their progress on probation. If there are any violations of probation, then we'll make recommendations as to how those violations should be handled. And it's not always a imposed scenario wherein we're attempting to get an individual sentenced to state prison. We do look at other sanctions that can address the behavior as opposed to returning them or sending them to state prison. Now, since the advent of AB 109, or Public Safety Realignment, as many of you know, the Probation Department is the lead agency relative to supervision, and to date, we have received about 10,000 individuals on post-release community supervision, and we average about 900 a month. And our role in that regard, again, is for individuals that are considered non-serious, non-violent, non-sexual offenders. Rather than them being paroled to the state, they are placed on post-release community supervision, with probation being the supervision agency. Now, I think all of you know this, but whenever I address an audience, I'm always very careful to let individuals understand that when these individuals are deemed as non-serious, non-violent, non-sexual offenders, obviously they're looking at the legal definition of non-serious, non-violent pursuant to section 667.5 and 1192 of the Penal Code. However, these individuals do have those type of offenses in their history. So public safety realignment only looks at the offense for which an individual is currently serving their time in state prison. So it might be a petty theft with a prior, or it might be a drug offense, but when you look in their criminal history, they could have aggravated assault, carjacking, you name it, all of the non-serious, all of the serious and violent felonies that are stated by the Penal Code. So I always want to give that disclaimer. We do have quite a few individuals that we're supervising that meet that profile. When we get a case from CDCR, we go through a process of determining their eligibility. We run them through a battery of risk and needs assessment. We work very closely with the Department of Mental Health, the Department of Public Health, to develop a case plan for supervision to address the needs of these individuals and to give them a roadmap to be successful on public safety realignment. One of the things that you'd be interested in, and that is probably most relevant to what we're talking about today in terms of how long an individual would serve on post-release community supervision. The legislation allowed for an individual that is successful on supervision for a period of 6 months could be considered eligible for early termination. And by successful, we mean that, or the legislation states that an individual that has not committed a violation that results in a return to custody. Now, they may do something, but if they don't, if it doesn't result in a return to custody, they remain eligible to be terminated at 6 months. The legislation also indicates that if an individual is successful for a 12-month period of time, we must, it's no longer the possibility of terminating them early, or we have the discretion to terminate them early. At 12 months, if they have completed 12 months worth of supervision without committing an offense that will result in custody time, we must terminate them early. Our chief has taken a posture that for the 6-month possibility, we have not entertained early termination. As you might imagine, we would view that as just too soon to be able to determine whether or not a person has really embraced the rehabilitative process. We're just getting to know these individuals through the supervision process, and 6 months is just too soon. So barring any extraordinary circumstance, he has taken a posture that we will not terminate the 6-month process. One of the things that realignment has done, and even prior to realignment, SB 678, which allowed for incentivized payments, if you will, or awards to probation departments for reducing the number of individuals that they send to state prison. Prior to SB 678, there had not been given a whole lot of attention to individuals on adult probation. Most of the attention over the last 30 to 40 years has been on juvenile probationers, and rightfully so. There was the thought that the youth are the ones that we can rehabilitate. They're the ones that are still pliable, will listen, have not become hardened by the system. But in the last 5 to 10 years, there has been studies, and Sheriff Baca kind of alluded to the brain development, and we've started to look at the brain development of emerging adults, those individuals between the ages of 18 to 25, and we've looked at their ability to make sound decisions and their maturation. And so there has been some attention given to the rehabilitative process for those individuals. Realignment has allowed us to look at the entire adult population with a view towards trying to determine other programs, other resources, other rehabilitative processes that we can utilize for that population. And one of the byproducts, despite all of the opinions, and opinions abound relative to what is going to transpire with public safety realignment, it's too soon. We don't have a real evaluation as to whether or not it's been successful. It's too soon to even evaluate the program. But one of the byproducts of it, and I think one of the speakers already alluded to this, is the synergistic relationships that have been developed between all of the county agencies, the community-based, faith-based organizations, and there has been a coming together to look at how we can successfully throw a net of services around these individuals, unlike any other program that we have had in history. And so the question was posed earlier about whether or not, or the question could be posed, does probation work? What about the recidivism rates between probation and parole? And I think everybody's familiar with the 70% parole recidivism rate. Probation across the state would have just the opposite numbers. The most recent report that I looked at from CPOP suggested that there was only a 23 to 25% recidivism rate, so the numbers would be just the opposite. So with probation being properly funded, and I say that with emphasis on adult probation, with it being properly funded and with the net of services that can be wrapped around an individual, that probation is a very viable alternative in this whole discussion of sentencing reform.
Reaver, I have another question here. Outside of Norco, Ironwood, and Chino, what programming is available for youth under the age of 18 tried as adults?
You know, I'm not totally aware of what the other programs that would be other than those three facilities. We offer programs, as you know, these individuals that are found unfit are first housed in the juvenile facilities in LA County, and Barry J. Nightoff is the hall that houses all of these individuals. And prior to them going to the state facilities, we offer a very comprehensive array of programs for that population. What happens once they go to the state facilities, I'm not totally sure, but I do know at the county level that at Barry J. Nightoff we have a very comprehensive education program, and also substance abuse counseling, cognitive behavioral therapy. Many of you know that we are under a DOJ a settlement agreement, which really compelled us to even further look at how we were delivering services, not only to the unfit population of those individuals being tried as an adult, but all of our individuals within our probation halls and camps. And we've developed a number of programs for all of them. But again, what happens once they go to the state level, I'm not sure.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions here. Hannah, I'm going to come to you now. Let me throw a couple of questions out and see if when you speak that these raise any issues with you. One of the questions here is, what purpose is served by sentencing an M3 to 42 years in county jail? I don't think we have any actually sentenced 42 years. 44 years, is that what it is? 44 years. One. And then we have a number, 16, 18, 19, I've seen. But what purpose is served in that if after, as I said, the studies show that after 5 years, rehabilitation is not likely to be effective. The other question is, and Sheriff, you can, on this one also, you can chime in after Hannah. What do you think the private prisons, of the private prisons that are growing into $1 billion business by stockholders requiring at least 3 to 3.5 years sentences? So if you want to talk about that, I'd also throw out, do you think that the inability of the prisons to meet their requirement to reduce the population shows it's time to have a change in determinate sentencing?
Okay, I think I'll deal with most of those in the context of my remarks, and I'll tack some of the specific answers onto the end. There's one thing, because I know you may have to leave shortly, Reaver, and I just want to, I would like to make a clarification because you gave a lot of really important and helpful information. Can everybody hear me? No. Oh. Because you gave such great information, there is one thing that you said that I am afraid that might lead people to make a conclusion that's inaccurate, and I want to just address it before you're not here to correct me if I'm wrong. You talked about the post-release community supervision population, and can everybody hear me now? Okay, great. You talked about that PRCS, as we call it in our criminal speak. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
And you talked about how those individuals on PRCS can have violent histories. But I just want to clarify that there are two sets of populations that are newly assigned to the authority of the county level officials. One is the category of 1170H offenders that are being newly sentenced and are going to serve whatever sentence they have or whatever disposition happens with their case at the county level. Those folks are absolutely nonviolent. They don't have violence in their histories. They cannot be sent to serve their sentence in jail if they have a violent history. The PRCS population is a separate population. I don't want us to conflate them too much because I don't want people to get confused that this whole influx of people is not a distinct population of non-serious, non-sexual, non-violent offenders. It is. The 1170H population that's sentenced to jail now is non-violent and can be distinguished from the population that goes to prison now. This PRCS population would be coming to the county anyway. It just would be coming to the county under a different authority. And so I just don't want people to think that there's this massive influx of people that have potentially have dangerous histories that are coming into the county that never would have been coming into the county before. That's not an accurate conclusion from the facts that Mr. Bingham presented. And so I just wanted to clarify.
Hannah, why don't you tell them what PRCS people are then? They are parolees.
They would have been parolees, right? So they're people who would have been released to parole previously and now are released to this new category, this new nomenclature of post-release community supervision. But I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands that distinction so that there's not this conflation that I think has been happening too much when people become concerned that there is a whole new set of population of violent people being sent to the counties.
Before you move on, there's another question here that really, you're right at that point. So
Okay.
It says, why are non-violent sex offenders included in the NNN group?
First of all, let me just indicate that the comments that were just made is absolutely correct. And we do speak of these populations sometimes interchangeably, but the ones that I was focusing on is the group that is being paroled or would be considered paroled. We don't even use that term. They're released on post-release community supervision, and they are the individuals that can have these type of offenses in their past. The ones that are sentenced to the county jail cannot. They can still be sentenced to state prison. The other thing that the distinction we should make as well is that it's not an early release program. The individuals that are being released on post-release community supervision are being released to what their previously established parole dates would have been. The only thing that, again, that changed is the supervision entity. It's not the Department of Parole Operations, it's the probation department, so that's absolutely true.
Thank you. Okay. Now,
Go ahead.
Okay. Now thank you so much for having me this morning. I'm so glad to be here, and I really have appreciated already the great interaction with this great audience. As you heard from the judge, the sheriff, and Mr. Bingham and Ms. Gord, and so far, there are themes that we've been struggling with over time, and they're complicated. So questions surrounding the interplay of discretion and individuation of sentencing on the one hand versus certainty on the other. the role of respect for the law and dignity of the individual in achieving a system that is just and effective, and the best way to infuse our sentencing schemes with proportionality and equality. And really, the basic question of what do we intend to do when we do criminal law? These things are perennial, and they're important and difficult questions. So I just want to state at the outset that, you know, these are not new, and they're not simple. And I think the judge did an excellent job of laying out some of the history of that in the beginning. So where are we today? We've had decades of this massive explosion in incarceration, and really almost a singular resort to incarceration. And I think that has caused, globally in American society, a loss, a sort of atrophy of our ability to bring other tools to bear on the kinds of questions that we're asking when we're trying to deal with behavior that we categorize as criminal. And it kind of seems to me like that whole problem where if your tool belt only has a hammer in it, every problem looks like a nail. And what we've had in the last, really since that 1974, about that time frame that the judge laid out as kind of a crystallizing point here in California, around since that time we've had this massive explosion in incarceration. And what does that really mean? It means that we went from a rate of 100 per 100,000 people incarcerated in 1975 to 753 per 100,000 people incarcerated today. We're across the country, we incarcerate more than 2 million people. That doesn't include people who are on probation and parole around the country. We have 5% of the world's population. We incarcerate 25% of the world's prisoners. We're the highest incarcerator. So there has been a significant change, and I think that that has gone along with this over-reliance on incarceration as sort of the first and sometimes only response to criminal behavior. And we do need to start funding the probation and other county and state and federal actors who are dealing with these people that we've now criminalized, and sort of inculcate this newer philosophy. So the swelling of the rolls, this incredible explosion in incarceration, has caused the system to start to buckle, and that's dovetailed with the fiscal crises over the last number of years. And so that's brought us to sort of this moment today, where we've started to see states like a state where I did a lot of criminal justice work in Texas and other states, really adopting a very new type of reform that's thinking about sentencing differently, maybe sometimes mostly for fiscal reasons, but there's a little bit of what has been called, did you call it a renaissance, sir? Yes, a renaissance of maybe looking at these different kinds of tools that we might have in our arsenal. And so I think what we're seeing is a return to some aspects of the rehabilitative ideal that was ascendant earlier in our century, but with some different standards. We now have a rehabilitative sensibility that looks at how effective will this intervention be, and demands accountability and effectiveness as we implement these new, more cost-efficient kinds of solutions. So the needs of our time are different, and so are the solutions that we have today. But we have seen, an interesting thing is that public support for rehabilitation and alternatives to incarceration has never waned very significantly. It's always been supported, even while there's been either a correct or a misimpression that there really is this, lock 'em up needs to be the answer. In 1968, a Harris poll found 73% of people believed rehabilitation to be the main goal of punishment. In our poll this year that we commissioned through Tulchin Research, we found 87% of California likely voters said that they wanted to see, bless you, alternatives to incarceration for low-level offenders. And I'll talk in a few minutes a little bit about some of the options for doing that. And I think that that it's important to know how much support there is for those kinds of proposals and those kinds of approaches. And I just wanted to, I'm going to give you a couple of quotes of some luminaries that either in past or even today are talking about these issues in interesting ways. So Justice Kennedy in 2003 in a keynote address to the American Bar Association said, "When it costs so much more to incarcerate a prisoner than to educate a child, we should take special care to ensure that we are not incarcerating too many persons for too long." So that I thought was interesting. And then just this year, just on July 23rd, in the annual letter to the Sentencing Commission that the Department of Justice has to send at least annually, the Department of Justice said this: "We must ensure that our federal sentencing and corrections system is strong but smart, credible, productive, and just, and budgetarily sound. But maximizing public safety can be achieved without maximizing prison spending. The federal prison population and prison expenditures have been increasing for years. In this period of austerity, these increases are incompatible with a balanced crime policy and are unsustainable. We believe federal sentencing policy should be reviewed, both systematically and on a crime-by-crime basis, through the lens of public safety spending productivity." So I think that is a crystallization of this sort of new, this renaissance of both believing and bringing to bear more of the rehabilitative kinds of interventions, but also with this lens of having to justify that they're effective and requiring programs to demonstrate, and they have capably and amply demonstrated their successfulness, but that is part of what we're doing when we're bringing those tools today. So really, the moment of opportunity that we have today in California, occasioned by the Plata and Coleman rulings that the judge told you about, and a growing recognition of the failure of incarceration policies, has caused us to start a front-to-back reevaluation of how we do incarceration in the state of California. It's involved the agencies at the county levels coming together and actually having conversations that they haven't had maybe for quite a long time. And it's involved the necessity of the counties to start solving these problems differently, because what realignment did not do is it didn't just, at least it wasn't intended to just be a shifting of bodies. It wasn't a rearranging of deck chairs. It was a recognition that there is an advantage to the counties, to people being housed in their communities and returned to their communities for their sentencing, and the advantages that counties can bring to dealing with these individuals. And also, it's the law absolutely encourages in various ways and authorizes in various and many new ways the implementation of alternatives to incarceration. So we've seen a lot of counties starting to step up to the plate. We have a report that there are copies of on the table going into lunch, so if you're interested in having a report, and if we run out, I can probably try to send you one if you let me know. But it's also available online if you don't want to waste the paper. Some of the conclusions in the report that we put out a few months ago are that there are some counties that are really stepping up to the plate. There's also, unfortunately, a lot of counties that look like they're, at least in the way they're funding things, resorting to maybe replicating some of the problems at the state level and just simply saying, okay, we've got new people, we need to have more capacity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about the specific question you asked about transfers in just a minute. Some counties are business as usual, but what do we need to do at the state and the county level now to continue to get this implementation going and get it right? Because it takes a while, and we're almost at the year point now. At the state level, we do have to require some reporting and demand results in reducing recidivism, especially as we continue to unfold sort of the funding formula of how counties get their money, because if we really are about reducing recidivism and reducing our reliance on incarceration, we need to see those results before we just continue to ramp up the funding and end up with replication of that state level problem. And we need the state, and also we need to require that the evidence-based reforms are implemented at the county level. This includes the expansion of things like your education-based incarceration program and in fact transitioning people to programs earlier so that if they've reached that point where there's diminishing returns on what can happen in the incarceration setting, let's get them into those settings that are more effective and certainly more cost efficient. And also we need to deal with that pretrial population. We've got 70% of prisoners in our jails around the state that are pretrial. That means, this has been talked about a little bit, but that means that those people are not sentenced. They haven't been adjudicated guilty of anything, and in fact, because of our bail system, it's really a function of whether somebody has the money to pay bail and not whether they've been determined to be a flight risk or a danger of reoffense during that pretrial period. So we need to really do a better job around the state, and the counties that are doing it are having enormous success. So we need to continue to do that, and we are talking about, I know that there have been discussions about a pretrial release program that's more robust here in the county, and we're looking forward to seeing that get implemented. And also other alternatives to incarceration. The sheriff talked about electronic monitoring, et cetera. But we also need the state to enact front-end sentencing reform. And you asked me to mention that one of the things, for example, that the ACLU and other organizations have supported is a bill that will come back next session. But this session it was Senate Bill 1506, sponsored by Senator Leno, which would have revised penalties for drug offenses across the board, drug possession, simple drug possession across the board to be misdemeanors. Now they're felonies, or some of them are chargeable as a felony or misdemeanor. So that's an important reform. There need to be a lot of other changes at the state level so the state can support the counties in this reform and can free up a lot of these resources so that we can really embrace the proven evidence-based rehabilitation kinds of interventions that are being demanded and the people want and are the right way to address this behavior. We've got to reduce recidivism at the back end. That's what we need to be doing. So we've heard some about some issues and struggles getting realignment fully implemented, and but I think as we move ahead, we're really seeing the opportunity and the positive side of that challenge that we have. And so we're looking forward to working with our county partners and also at the state level to continue these reforms. So I think that what we really need to just do is move forward in this ongoing struggle to focus on rehabilitation that is smart, effective, and cost efficient, and save the prisons and jails for the worst offenders. The one other thing I will answer, and I'm not sure if I'm going way over time, but I just want to answer your question about transfers. There had been some discussion about possibly resorting to some transfers of prisoners, and I was asked by the judge whether the ACLU supports transfer of prisoners either out of state or out of county. That's just the wrong way to go, and if we're doing it, it would only need to be as a last resort if we've really exhausted all of our pretrial release options, all of our alternatives to incarceration. The sheriff himself told you that we very much through cycling really won't really exceed significantly or even may not even get to an overcrowded situation. We're not there yet. Let's try these other things. Let's really embrace the philosophy that the sheriff has espoused today, and that is the necessary one for this county to move forward. And we hope that we will not need to get to a situation where we would consider transfers.
Hannah, thank you very much. We have a million questions here, but I do want to let Kylie speak before we get to it. There is a question, is California still sending inmates out of state for profit prisons?
Oh.
And the answer is the Department of Corrections is doing that. We're not doing that out of Los Angeles County.
No.
And that's a whole other discussion. But the answer is yes, they still are. And I don't know the extent to which they're doing it. And there's a second part to that question that we'll get to. So Kylie, I do have a question for you that is here. So they must have read something about your survey. It says, what kind of response did you get to your survey? And so that leads me right into...
Okay, great. Well, I'm happy to talk about that, but I'm also, I want to say thank you to the League of Women Voters and to all the partners for bringing all of us here together to talk about this, and to really to my fellow panelists. It's been very educational. And I'm particularly thrilled to go after Hannah because I want to build on some of the things she said and maybe take it a little bit further. And hopefully that won't get me in too much trouble. I want to come back to one of the questions, Judge Wesley, that you opened with, which is whose responsibility is it? Who's responsible for alleviating the overcrowding that we have? And I'm going to say that it's ours. It's all of our responsibility. All of us here up on the panel, all of us here in this room. Because we have to stop thinking about prisons as a means of social control. We have to stop criminalizing behavior we don't like and get serious about promoting public safety first. Sheriff Baca, you always say we can't incarcerate our way out of this problem. I love it that you say that, and it's so important that you say that because it's really true, and I think that really embodies what we're talking about. You can't quarantine your way out of smallpox. And this is something we talk about a lot at the Violence Prevention Coalition, is really seeing violence as a public health issue, as an epidemic, and not necessarily as a criminal issue first. So what does that mean to frame it that way? It means that we're talking about addressing some of the root problems. Again, we're not trying to incarcerate our way out of behavior we don't like. We're actually trying to take responsibility for it and trying to address it. Scott Wood, you opened us up with such a beautiful example of Steve Bell. And I think that illustrates some of what we're talking about how do we build structures and systems that support positive behavior choices instead of supporting systems that continue to push people deeper and deeper into the criminal justice system and lead to overcrowded prisons and then a collapsing system that really is more than it should be handled, and as Hannah said, doesn't allow that system to do what it should be doing, which is addressing the people who are actually risks to public safety. So part of that means, I think there's been a lot of talk about being tough on crime and how do we navigate that, and I like to talk about being tough on responsibility. That means not just individual responsibility, but our collective responsibility. Laurel, you mentioned the legislator who said, well, this time it's not political. And that's where I think it is our responsibility to engage with our legislators, with our elected officials, to say, this is what I care about, and to support them when they're doing the right thing. Call them up and let them know. Get your groups together, get the people in your networks, call them up and let them know, because that is part of what will provide them the political cover to do the right thing. And we all know they're interested in getting reelected. And if they think that the climate out there is demanding that they be tough on crime, that's how they're going to vote. That's the kind of legislation that they're going to pass. So it is up to us to let them know. As Hannah said, I thought this was amazing. The support for a rehabilitative approach has always been there. It's in fact at record highs. Let's take advantage of that. Yeah. Let's let them know. The support is here. We got your back if you'll take some of these steps. I think that's where, vote, call your legislators, send letters, let them know. That this is something that we can really start to move, and I think that AB 109 is really an incredible opportunity to rethink incarceration and to rethink rehabilitation. I think what we've heard today from Reaver and from Sheriff Baca is a real thinking about how do we reintegrate people back into the community. Most of these folks are coming back. I really applaud Sheriff Baca for saying, he is thinking about their return to the community from the moment that they are incarcerated. And I think that approach is something that AB 109 can really let us leverage. to really talk about how do we think about reintegration, and I say that reintegration into the community from incarceration a little bit differently. And I think there's sort of 2 points of entry where we can start to talk about this, because we can talk about it on the front end with reducing the sentencing. And if you haven't read the ACLU report, grab it, read it. You know, one of the things they talk about is how do we reduce the bail so that people get back out? How do we reduce and send them to alternative sentencing? And what's really great about this report is that they have the statistical backup to say that this does not impact public safety. You know, having these low-level people back in the community does not is not a threat to public safety. So again, that's something that the more we can articulate that, the more we can share that, the more we can really start to move some of this. So that's the redirecting from incarceration in the first place. And the second place is when they come out. You know, we know that the folks who are the most at risk at committing more crimes and more violent crimes are those who are returning from incarceration. The same way the greatest risk factor of being shot is that you were already shot. You know, we know who these folks are, and we know where they're going, and that's where I can tie into the question that started this, which is that how do we strengthen that process of reintegration? How do we build that bridge a little more effectively, and so that the people who are returning are actually reintegrated, and we can reduce their likelihood of committing new crimes, committing more violent crimes. And we do that by connecting them to support services. I don't think any of this is new to anybody. I think it's just a question of how do we invest in it and how do we actually make it happen. And I can tell you one of the things that we're doing, Judge Wesley referenced the survey. We've been working with a number of organizations, including the Los Angeles I was going to get to them, but I was going to say actually this is the Los Angeles Reentry Roundtable with the Center for Health Justice, with the Los Angeles Regional Reentry Partnership, with Amity Foundation. This is a real collaboration of folks who are trying to do a pretty comprehensive mapping of who's doing what, where. In Los Angeles County, who are the community-based organizations that are doing this work and doing it well, and what capacity do they have? So the purpose of that is again to sort of have a sense of who's actually doing the work, and where are they in the county. This is this leads into something else, but LA County is huge. You know, as Sheriff Baca said, it's you know, got a prison population larger than most states, and to try to think about LA as a singular entity, I think is to set yourself up to not be effective. And so part of the idea with mapping who's doing what is to see where are they. So that we can start to connect people who are doing reentry in certain regions around Los Angeles to each other. Again, so we can strengthen that network, as Reaver talked about, that's a stronger network of support so that when people are coming out, you know, it's not just, oh, maybe go to this agency or maybe go to that agency or go to that one all the way across the county or out in Antelope Valley and down in Santa Monica and try to make that crosstown bus. But that we're building and strengthening collaboratives on a regional, local level so that people can get the services where they are. So that's the project, and I think that's an important part of it, is to say how do we strengthen these communities into which not everybody, we're not all in prison, but how do we strengthen the communities that this reentry population is coming back into under whatever form of supervision, so that we can redirect them, that we can create again those positive supports, but you know, as Sheriff Baca was saying, the self-development classes, all of these things that will help to learn positive behaviors so that we can reduce recidivism and increase public safety. So to answer, we've had a lot of responses to the survey. We've been putting together, I think we have a list that we've gotten from the various networks of people, folks who have shown up for when they did the juvenile reentry blueprint, everybody who showed up to those 5 summits. I think we have about 1,000 contacts that we're working through. We imagine it'll take us a while. We've had some great help from Amity. They've had folks who were formerly incarcerated are actually making a lot of the phone calls to say, who are you, what are you doing, because they know what services they needed when they got out. So it's a peer, I want to say a peer-to-peer, but they're actually helping to develop, what are the pieces that they need, and then to design what that resource would look like and what that tool would look like, so that again we can connect people to services and we can strengthen the networks and coalitions of community-based organizations so that they can really help people in an integrated way. And I see Jaylene here, so I want to give a little shout out. I think there's a group in Pasadena, Altadena, their Reintegration Council that's really been a bit of a model for how this can work. There's another coalition that's emerging out of South Los Angeles that we're working with, and we're hoping to have a framework soon that talks about what that looks like and how to replicate and adapt that. So.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
So Professor Levinson, I've got a bunch of questions here. I'm going to throw these questions at you, and then if anything you've heard leads you to something that you want to discuss.
If I know any answers, I'll
Feel
jump
free.
in. Yeah.
I left the hard ones for you. So, what can be done to amend the felony murder rule, at least with regard to sentencing?
Got it. All right. Do you want me to do them one at a time, or just
I'm just going to give these to you.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in real fast with the world's fastest introduction and then go to answering as many questions as I can. First of all, I look around this room and I'm amazed. Just quality people here. We're very fortunate to have all of you and our speakers today as well. The one person who didn't get that applause who really deserved it is Judge Wesley, so that's most important. We have Scott Wood, who's doing restorative justice. Some of you might not have noticed that Paula Mitchell is in the room. She is the author with Judge Alarcon of the death penalty study that goes to the Prop 34. We have Sheriff Baca, who is doing so much, and I want to emphasize with so little. The one thing I haven't heard much in the discussion here is how you're supposed to do all this rehabilitation without many resources or in facilities that third world countries would be ashamed to have to house their inmates in. So that's a political issue, but a really darn important one. We have Judge Turlin, who has been a leader in our court system. Grab these people later on or at lunch. Find out everything they have to offer. My perspective generally, and this will lead me to your question, is we have an incredibly difficult sentencing system. And one of the things that's most difficult about it is this balancing of safety versus the resources. And we can sit here and say we're on the right track. But from the public image perception, all it takes is one Willie Horton. We all know that's true. And the bottom falls out. And so there's an enormous public education challenge in front of us, and I thank the League for taking this on from the beginning here. We're going to be we've been talking about sentencing, and in answering the felony murder question, the one aspect I want us to think about is not just the issues that come up with sentencing. All of this comes up at the time of charging. And we don't have the people who do the charging sitting at the table. But we do have a district attorney's race coming up. And if we're going to talk about sentencing reform, one of the things we have to talk about is how and what do we charge. So now your felony murder question. Felony murder is a very broad law that we have in California. Not all states have it. Many have rejected it. It is an anachronism from way back when, where if I shotteth your fouleth and I happen to getteth youeth, we charge me with murder as well. In other words, if I'm involved in no good, doing a felony and somebody accidentally dies, what the heck, I'm a felon, charge me as a murderer as well. And that's the basic way that felony murder works here in California, which is as long as you are an accomplice to a murder, accomplice to a felony, I should say, even if you never wanted anyone to get hurt, you are that idiot 18-year-old. We all know them, who are sitting in a car and they're cruising by. That person doesn't have to have any weapon, doesn't like weapons, but one of their friends does the wrong thing and shoots somebody. Or they're burglarizing, or they're in a 7-Eleven and somebody has a heart attack and dies. That becomes a murder charge. And that takes on all the significance you've heard about today. And then layer it with this: if the person does happen to have substantial involvement and does realize the risk, that becomes a capital case where you could get the death penalty. So someone asked the question, what could we do to reform felony murder? We could do what we're doing today, which is this whole movement towards sentencing reform, I take it, is to give more of an inspection of the individual and the risks that they pose. Felony murder law does exactly the opposite. It just says, you were there, you were bad, throw them in with the lot. And we could say that we no longer want felony murder, that we want to charge people as murderers if in fact they acted with the intent to kill or they realized the risk they might kill. And that way you will have more individualization. And if you have more individualization, you can direct your resources and your rehabilitation and your education accordingly. So the person who wants to kill, I'm sure the sheriff will agree, has a very different educational plan in front of him than the idiot who is in the car or elsewhere when a felony murder takes place. That answers that question, I hope.
I think it does. So, 3 strikes is an example of mandatory sentence which incarcerates a person convicted of a non-serious, non-violent crime for life.
What can we do about that?
What's your view?
My view is Steve Cooley is right, which is 3 strikes when it involves violent offenders. And when we started talking about even Mr. Bell and what happened to him, he wasn't being sentenced for stealing anything. He was being sentenced for being a recidivist or labeled a criminal. And people just sort of got tired of him and wanted to put him behind bars forever. Now, you know, that's an easy solution, but not a very effective solution because it is so expensive, and therefore you are going to fill up your custodial situations with a lot of Mr. Bells who don't need to be there. And then there are people, we'll all admit in this room, who need to be behind bars because they are physically, and I want to emphasize that, physically dangerous and cannot be rehabilitated, whether they have mental health issues or other things, so that they could be safe on the street. So we need to get smart about 3 strikes. And I don't think a campaign to sort of get rid of 3 strikes altogether would have any effectiveness. But I think getting behind a district attorney or organizations that will reform the act to deal with only the violent offenders could have some traction. They haven't yet because the sophisticated conversation we've been having today doesn't fit in a 30-second TV spot by which these things are decided. So it is a real grassroots effort that is required to educate the public as to how 3 strikes works and how it really should work.
All right, this again for you, Professor.
I'm on a roll.
But
I get to grade myself.
I'll invite the other panel members if you want to express yourself on this. If capital punishment is eliminated by ballot initiative, how will that affect sentencing and overcrowding? And I will say that I saw an article in one of the newspapers that I clipped out, and it said that this idea of doing away with death penalty was running pretty popularly with the voters until the Colorado incident.
Right, there was an article in the LA Times.
I think that's where it was. And
Today.
then it lost traction. So if you want to address that, how would that affect jail overcrowding?
Well, you know, Ms. Mitchell's here, and Professor Mitchell probably has the better answer, but my reaction is that it's not really going to have an impact on what we're talking about here. Because the truth is that we already are keeping people who are sentenced to death in prison for at least 25 years, am I right about that?
20 at least.
And probably longer. So all it will do is take money that we would save from going through this facade, this sham of a death penalty process, and take the money, and the report has the statistics, it's a substantial amount, and be able to reinvest it into the re-education and the sheriff's programs and the other programs. So we will be housing people who commit capital offenses for the rest of their lives. That's a much less expensive proposition than going through capital prosecutions. So overall, you are, in terms of, you know, savings, you'll have money, and you can use it in different ways. If you have to build another facility for capital offenders, then you'll have the money to do that. But my guess is that you'll have additional money to use for educational processes that are needed for the non-capital offenders. The housing of capital offenders has, in my mind, very little, if anything, to do with the overpopulation in the prisons. That's not what the U.S. Supreme Court was addressing. It was not what the Plata case was addressing. You know, what those cases address are, if we are going to house people, you know, you have to make the investment in healthcare. You can't just sort of drop them in there in a pit and pretend that that's what we do in a civilized nation. Paula, did I get close to right on that?
Yeah, that's right. And there's another article coming out next week that looks at what's happened in the last year. And other studies have been done which basically show if nothing happens to change our system of capital punishment in California, between now and 2050, an additional 500 inmates will die on death row awaiting execution because the backlog will just continue to grow.
Right.
All right, I said we had a number of questions, so what I'm going to do is try to get to a lot of these questions in short answers. Well, no, I'm serious. I'm going to try to answer some of them shortly. I'm going to ask the sheriff if we could keep it brief, because I want to try to answer as many questions as we can. So, Sheriff, what training do your deputies get with respect to the education model that you've been talking about? And let me read the whole question. Jail guards have a majority of the interaction with the inmates. The way you see them is the way you treat them. The way you treat them is the way they become. Are we the largest jail system because we have the most criminals, or because we're overzealous in our incarceration? In
10 words or less.
Why don't you just read the first one and we'll get...
All right, let's do this. Education, with respect to your education model, what kind of training do your deputies get?
They go through courses relative to our curriculum, and our curriculum is well established. The merit program in itself has been put together by some significant scholars, people from the field of education, as well as the people within the jails themselves. Our training is designed to do two things. One, you know what's happening in the state. The state says we don't have any money for education, so therefore we can't do it. My theory is widen the role of the security staff. Security alone might be the primary mission traditionally, but they can still do more than just that. And the taxpayer deserves to see this innovative Renaissance thinking going on in institutions like jails. So we're not asking for more money, for more staff. We're not even asking to build more classrooms, although I think that would be a great idea, because of the problem with our economy, we can't seem to do it quite yet. Although I do have $100 million from the state to build a new women's facility, which I think is appropriate because women should not be housed like men in their incarceration environment. They should have opportunities for learning experiences that go well beyond academics. Some of the things involving what motherhood should entail. So that's a quick answer to this. Let's get to the next question.
Well, it says, are we the largest jail system because we have the most criminals or because we are overzealous in our use of incarceration as a solution to community problems? A part of that answer is we're the largest jail system because we're the largest county. We have a population that is gigantic. And as a result of that, there's always going to be a percentage of that population that are going to be committing crimes. But go ahead, Sheriff.
Well, we have undoubtedly a very, very troubled judicial system because it's overcrowded in every aspect. And I think that we're, like you said, Judge, we're the largest county in the United States, close to 11 million people. And it's just a byproduct of our county being large.
I agree with that.
Judge, can I jump in real fast?
Sure.
So I'm a former prosecutor, proud of it. But we have a judicial system where prosecutors are not really given the options as much as we might like to sort of say, okay, I've got a case here. What are the various programs I can put somebody in? Generally, prosecutors are making the decision, do I charge somebody or not charge somebody? Then it becomes an adversarial system, and once it's adversarial, they can work out plea deals. And that comes into the sentencing system. But one thing that could be considered, if we're looking at global changes that will ultimately affect sentencing, is creating more options for prosecutors, even at that charging phase. That how do we force people to get rehabilitation other than force them to be convicted and sentenced? And I'm not sure we figured that out.
May I back that up? We had a case, and I talked to the two candidates run for district attorney about this, up in the Lancaster area. You got 3 high school kids on their way to college. One decides to be the proverbial idiot. They see a car that's locked up and he goes up to the car. The other 2 are just following, like the typical crowd mentality. The kid breaks the window of the car and sees the opportunity for an object that's inside the car. So he breaks the window of the car. The deputies arrive. All of them get arrested for the same crime, a felony burglary. And one kid is already accepted into a smart university somewhere in the United States. And they all get charged for the same crime. And so the point then is, why is this charging process so indistinguishable? And so the one kid that mom's done all of her great work as a mother to get him to that point where he's acceptable to university, she's beside herself because she sees his future in prison or in jail. And I do believe, Lori, you brought out that deep secret of what is charging really supposed to entail. More discretion should be used.
Well, you should all understand that we don't have the district attorney here today, but the prosecutor, let me just real quickly, for those of you that don't understand how it works. Somebody is on the street and they get arrested. If they're arrested for a misdemeanor, that process is a little different than if they're arrested for a felony. But in each case, the police department provides, and we have 42, 43 police departments in Los Angeles County, 88 cities. We have 16 city attorney's offices, 1 district attorney office that does all felonies and misdemeanors in some of the unincorporated areas. Those prosecutors, the arrest report comes in, they decide what charge is going to be filed, not the arresting officer. The arresting officer can arrest for something, but the district attorney can, or the city attorney can look at that and say, you know what, these facts show me several crimes. Charging discretion is in the hands of the district attorney. In some cases, when it comes before a court after hearing evidence can strike a charge, and I'm not going to go into all the mechanisms, but the court has very little authority to change a charging decision by a district attorney. The other way a case comes to the court is if the district attorney takes a case to the grand jury, and the grand jury returns an indictment. And that indictment has the charges. And again, that is the discretion of the grand jury or the prosecuting agency. So that's how the cases get into the court, and I think Professor Levinson's right. But I think the DAs have a lot of discretion. I think if you have a district attorney that is out of control, we've had that around the state, then they have a discretion to file a case in many cases as a misdemeanor or a felony. And they don't exercise that discretion. They file all of them as a felony. Then you have a mix that doesn't work.
And Judge, I want to make sure the record is really clear, as we would say. First of all, I agree. They have a lot of discretion, and I'm actually not criticizing our particular district attorney. I think he's tried to be very innovative in how he addresses things like 3 strikes and the like. I want to just think about the front end of the process. Sentencing is the back end. But in all these efforts to do reform and re-education and different opportunities, are we giving those same opportunities on the front end? Are we telling prosecutors, here, it's not just a charge or not charge. Here are some other programs. I don't think we're doing it in part because we haven't developed them, we can't fund them. It wouldn't actually, the sheriff has responsibility once they're custodial. These may not be that custodial. So we are making those efforts, but I think we might want to do more.
Professor Levinson? Yes, Sheriff?
If I may, the reason the custodial part can be positive is simply this. We always have perfect attendance in class.
Jay, did you have a question? A good defense lawyer tries to contact the prosecutor early on and influence the charging. And if you have information that they don't have from the arrest report, you can actually do that. I want to move on. Sheriff, the question was, after your statement, does that mean that no new jails will be built in Los Angeles County?
Well, I think Lori also made a good point. Jails that have been built 60 or 70 years ago are nothing like what you truly need to properly house people in a way that would be defined as humane. There's one jail that I have, the old Central Jail side of what is Central Jail, that really has a terrible design, not only for the inmates, but for the deputies themselves who are required to make sure that everything goes smoothly. So let's not get to the idea that we say, well, any new jail is going to be something bad. The truth is we need to upgrade and we need to incorporate the massive amount of technology that's necessary to help the educational process. We are now in the information age. We have to do things better.
There's a question here. Am I inferring that the Sheriff Baca could go ahead and implement ankle bracelets for non-non-nons? I don't tell the sheriff what to do.
I'm requesting that the board approve this. And all it takes is 3 votes from the board. I think they're going to do it. So this is on its way.
It's a Board of Supervisors decision. That's what's provided in AB 109. It's not a court's decision. Who wrote AB 9? They had time to review the drafts. Did they share their information? What were their interests? Why did they write the bill? This could take another half hour, but if you want to do it quick.
The people who started it was the Human Rights Watch, and I'm sure that the goal they would have liked to achieve was to do away with life without parole for juveniles, because it's not in line with the civilized society to lock up people under the age of 18 for the rest of their lives. And I think they had to deal with the political realities, so they worked at it. It's been a very difficult struggle. They and also the Friends Committee on Legislation, the Catholic Conference, and other groups have worked very hard to finally get it to the point where now it's passed the Assembly. Now it has to go for reconciliation between the Assembly and the Senate, and then it's going to the governor's desk. It'll almost certainly get past that, and then it's going to the governor's desk.
So would AB 109 come from the governor's office?
Well, I thought you asked 9.
No, 109. AB 109, the realignment. Realignment. She's talking about SB 9, but the question was AB 109.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was answering SB 9.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll shut up.
Well, AB 109 came from the governor's office. And let me just say, in answer to what a lot of the panelists have said, what you've heard here today is a view towards rehabilitation and getting people out. But there is another side to this that we're not talking about today. And if they were here, they'd be very vociferous. And that is the victims' rights advocates. And they are up in Sacramento. And it is a tough choice for a legislator on any of these issues. Because if you're the victim and your child has been killed, you're not so anxious for rehabilitation. You're not so anxious to have that person out of jail. In fact, you're anxious for them to be in as long as they can. Interestingly, not necessarily are you anxious for the death penalty. I've had many victims in my court with cases that you think that the family would want the death penalty, urging the district attorney not to seek the death penalty, but to file the special circumstances and seek life without possibility of parole. So that is an interesting thing that shows up in the court. But if you were asked them, do you want this person to ever get out, they would say no. So what you're hearing here is a portion of the conversation that is going on statewide. It is a tough choice for a legislator because the victims' families, the victim advocates, they're there and they're in their face. And they're also in our courts. They give what we call victim impact testimony, and it will rip your heart out if you sit and listen to some of these stories. So these are not easy issues that we're talking about. I think we're about out of time. I have a lot more questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but I want to thank each of the panelists. I think this was a wonderful discussion for you to hear.
I know I was trying to send you this note.
We'd want to just do a little wrap-up. I want to thank all of the associates that we had that brought in their people. We had a fine crowd. And I wanted to mention our little flyer out there on Guide to Inmate Voting. And I want you to take a copy, but with the caveat that we are now revising it to go along with the new law, because, of course, everything changes when they make new laws. The scholarships that we had for some of the students was just beautiful, and the Drug Policy Alliance paid for most of them. There's some league members that did. There's some Loyola staff that did, and I think that was just wonderful to have that opportunity. I had a friend that said, instead of using the so calm and erudite Sentencing Reform Forum as a title, we should have said the compound sentences and the dangling prisoners. I like that one. To wrap up and say another welcoming to everybody is our president of the League of Women Voters of Los Angeles, David Holtzman.
Good afternoon. Hi. I want to start this wrap-up that I've been asked to give with a big thank you to Gene Thompson and the League people, the League staff and interns who helped put this event together. The turnout's terrific. Thank you all. Thank all of you for being here, because this was a great place to learn, and now we'll get the message out about all these very important pieces of information that will help us reform our criminal justice system in the future. Let me specifically thank our community partners while I'm here, and I have a list of you all. The Center for Restorative Justice here at Loyola Law School, thank you. The Violence Prevention Coalition, the Project for the Innocent at Loyola Law School, the Drug Policy Alliance. I did not really know you were going to be here today, but I'll tell you, I've been a member. I may still be a member. I know you asked me for a renewal really recently. Los Angeles Regional Reentry Partnerships, Friends Outside in LA County, Friends Committee on Legislation of California, Valley Sunset Business and Professional Women, the ACLU of Southern California, the Beverly Hills Bar Association, to which I paid $30 for some CLE, continuing legal education credits today, the LA County Bar Association, the Common Cause, and the League of Women Voters of LA County. Thank you all. And thank you also to the caterers here and the staff. That's really good stuff. A couple of dates that were left out from the history lesson we got. One, we heard about 1920. That was when women got the right to vote nationwide, where at least their right to vote was acknowledged. 1911, who knows what 1911 was? California suffrage, that's right. LA County's vote was very important in that. County San Francisco actually voted against it in 1911. Kind of like pointing that out. Now, how about 1974? Who knows that date? Nah, that's the date that men were allowed to become full members of the League of Women Voters. So all you men out there, you're more than welcome to join. The League is obviously not just about women's issues anymore, and is not just women. The League encourages informed and active participation in community governance, and we educate, like we're doing today, on important issues, and sometimes we actually do advocacy and try and influence public policy based on positions we take through thorough study of issues by members. So those are great things to be involved with. There are membership envelopes out there, and if you forget to take one and you want to join, you can always join online at lwvlosangeles.org. Now, I've been asked to, please do consider joining if you're not a member. Now, I've been asked to just give a quick wrap-up, and to do that, I'm just going to mention a few of the pearls of wisdom, the gems that we heard today, and maybe offer a couple of comments on them, so I can send you all home with a little review. I'm getting those CLE credits, as you said, so I had to take notes anyway. The first thing we heard from, first person we heard from after we're being introduced, after the introduction of Judge Wesley was Judge Wesley. And I'm going to do this on the fly, so I'm kind of looking at my pad here. But the first thing he said, he gave us a great lesson. He said that history repeats itself, and that's a great thing to keep in mind. He mentioned that the prison board of directors back in the day was reluctant to release people because of concerns about publicity, and that's never changed. And he said that rehabilitation is a matter that's properly in the discretion of administrative agencies. And that's also something to consider, because let's tell the administrative agencies what factors we'd like them to consider, and if we can, change official policies to have them consider those factors. As a League of Women Voters person, I like to think that someone who votes regularly shows some responsibility to the community. So maybe we could see about, just off the top of my head, using someone's voting history as a factor in their sentencing. Seriously, if someone's been a regular voter, they're community-minded, right? Of course, one of the positions that the League of Women Voters has is that felons should never lose their right to vote. No one should ever have their right to vote taken away from them. And when you think about it, administering an election would be really easy in a prison. You know where to find the people, and could call them out one by one to come to the ballot and cast their ballot. And they have plenty of time in prison to read up on the issues, right? So anyway, back to that. The Judge Wesley also told us about triads. I think what he meant by that was that you have a middle term sentence, and you have an upper limit and a lower limit if you're a judge within which you're provided some discretion in sentencing. He also mentioned that some upper limit and a lower limit. Did I mention that? Yeah, okay. Anyway, he also said that some dang law gave us the purpose of incarceration punishment without mentioning rehabilitation, et cetera, which didn't sound so great to us, did it? He talked about AB 109, the realignment bill, how it was originally a spot bill and became one of those mushroom bills that sprouts up in the middle of the night, and most of the public only had 2 days to review its text. He said the text became available on March 15th, which I thought was interesting because that's the Ides of March. So always look around the Ides of March. Beware of the Ides of March for what might pop up in the state legislature, not just Brutus. But it turns out we learned in one of the answers to questions that the bill did come from the governor's office, so there must have been some process, maybe behind closed doors, of drafting it, which goes to show you that in the legislative process, you kind of have to be an insider to really get your concerns heard in advance, because sometimes there just won't be much time when the bill's actually been formally proposed to influence it. All right, he also mentioned a Supreme Court decision about California's problem with health care and how the court upheld the remedy that the lower courts are imposing on California courts. But he mentioned some of the words from the dissents, like Scalia saying it was a radical injunction and terrible things will happen. Justice Alito saying it will lead to an increase in crime. And I think the mission of a lot of people in this room is to prove them wrong, right? So keep up that work. Thank you. Let's see what else we had. Laurel Gord from the Friends Committee gave us a good overview of what was going on in the state legislature about how Senators Leno and Hancock, as chair of the Public Safety Committee, have been holding back bills that would increase sentencing to fight overcrowding. And she mentioned another one of the league's pet peeves, term limits. She said that term limits have really messed up the way legislature has been considering policy. They're not just because of the institutional knowledge being lost as people leave, but people are always running for higher office, she said. Now, I'm not sure I'd call it higher office when someone runs for city council after they're in the state legislature, but that sure happens a lot. We're going to have almost a majority of our city council coming from the state legislature here pretty soon. But it is a higher office when you think about the salaries that they're paid. The salary that a city councilman's paid is tied to a judge's salary. And they make more when they come back to the city council from the state legislature. It's very strange, but that's sort of a league wonky point factoid to take home. And then Laurel also talked about SB 9, the Fair Sentencing for Youth Act, and that's moving forward, and it's great to be aware of that. Let's follow that. She also talked about the felony murder rule, and as did Professor Levinson, and how it does seem kind of crazy. Sheriff Baca was talking about the huge number of cases that have come down to county jail management and how his office is trying to deal with them. And I think it's terrific that he's got this education-based approach that he's using to treat the inmates and try and help essentially rehabilitate and empower inmates to go back and become responsible members of the community. I loved his quote. He said that a human being that does not value his or her own life will not value others, and that's a great thing to keep in mind. People, including Sheriff Baca, were talking about the inequities and how people with money can afford bail and get out on bail, and people who don't aren't afforded that luxury. You might also think that people who are violating the law, say with drug laws, and who are wealthy, might have an obligation to use their wealth to try and change those laws if they really think they're not doing something wrong. And that's just something to keep in mind. And, you know, I think campaign finance reformers are willing to carve out an exemption for people who are violating an existing law, want to change that law so that when they give money to campaigns to change the law, so that they're not calling attention to themselves through public disclosure as people who are violating the law when they're trying to change the law. Something to keep in mind. It's another, campaign finances and disclosure is something that the league is very involved with. But also, it's something I've always thought of. I'll take just a second to talk about this. I went through high school and college as a member of the age cohort that probably had the highest, regular use, the highest regular marijuana use. And as a result, I was actually active in trying to get marijuana laws repealed. Just a thought to keep in mind when you're thinking about drug sentencing. It's not just the sentencing, it's whether or not the act should be illegal in the first place. All right, and the league doesn't have a position on that, so don't go saying that the league agrees with me on that. Sheriff Baca was spot on when he said that learning theory is something that we really need to be aware of and educate ourselves on if we're going to be effective in this area. And reading skills, relationship skills, and sobriety skills are very important. Actually, I was so interested in drug laws that I took the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Certificate program up at UC Berkeley and learned about the various modalities for treating addicts, and that's something that I think, again, is valuable to fund, is drug treatment. All right, so Reaver Bingham from the probation department, gave some excellent facts about what his department does, about how probation and parole are different, and I wasn't really so aware that the probation department is involved so much from the start of someone's trip through the criminal justice system. He said in the bail process at the very beginning whether or not someone's going to be released on their own recognizance and that there might be supervised release before trial. He talked about how the non designation is only for current crimes, so that that people will, especially victims' rights advocates, will always be aware of what people might have done in their past, and it might not just be non-serious, non-sexual, and non-violent crimes. All right, and I love the factoid, here's a gem, that 70% of people on parole will recidivate, is that the word? And that the rate for probation is pretty much the opposite, only 23 to 25%. So there's things to look at there. What is probation doing right? And recidivism, though, again, I don't like seeing, personally, I don't like seeing the recidivism rate be just one lump sum figure, when you should really divide out the non crimes and the drug crimes from the violent crimes when you're studying this. So you data people, get me the numbers I want. Split that up. Thank you. Anyway, and then Hannah Dershowitz with the ACLU, I love it. She said, "We must deal with people we have now criminalized." Yeah, that's a good quote. And the poll data she mentioned that they commissioned through Tolkien Research, people do want those alternatives to incarceration, and like people were saying, it's up to us to let our policymakers know that. All right, so yes, and she also mentioned that we now recognize that there are advantages to bringing people back to their communities for incarcerations, their counties. Really, connection is going to be an important part of rehabilitation. And let's see, she mentioned Senator Leno's bill, SB 1506. Keep an eye on that one, see if it comes back to make all drug possession misdemeanor. So that the people who are charged with that can still vote, right? No, I don't think that was his intent. But again, it's just crazy that felons aren't allowed to vote. All right, Kylie Skilling. We love the Violence Prevention Coalition. I loved her quote saying that you can't quarantine your way out of smallpox. Let's take that one home, because it's the same thing with crime. And violence. It's a public health issue, like she said. The Violence Prevention Coalition has, as she mentioned, been working on how to manage and provide reentry services to prisoners who are coming home and getting out. There was a separate event that the League, I think, helped organize with the Violence Prevention Commission that had representatives from that Pasadena area service center she was talking about. It's a terrific model. If you're not familiar with that, get familiar with that. That Altadena experience seems to be working well. I'd love a follow-up. Since that event, I really haven't heard, but it sure was working well then. And all right, Professor Levinson was more or less put in the role of answering questions. I love what she had to say about felony murder as how it developed in the olden days. If you don't remember, she said, you could be charged, I could be charged with felony murder if I shot at your fowleth and happened to get youth from back in the day. So I was trying to poach your pheasant, but I happened to kill you, so no, that, obviously the intent wasn't there to kill somebody, and the ideas for reforming felony murder and in sentencing especially, and in charging, are very important. And that really leads me to the last point I wanted to talk about, and that is how there is, at least in our system, some accountability to the public for charging decisions. That is, we elect our district attorney. And although it's only an every 4 years election, elections, as civil rights leader Connie Rice once pointed out, are a time of accountability, when you can get politicians to consider your concerns. So we have an election coming up. There are two candidates. I did not hear, I was surprised, any of the panelists suggest which one of the two remaining candidates for district attorney would be better on these issues? The League of Women Voters never takes positions on candidates, so I'm not going to say, and I don't really know. But I encourage you to ask the people around you while we're still here if you have any opinion on that, because it's something I'm going to be asking people myself, because I'm going to be going out to vote in November, and I'm going to want an answer to that question, especially given what we learned here today. So let's all keep in mind what we learned here today. I need to tell you a couple of things. That the ACLU report that was mentioned earlier is available if you email Hannah Dershowitz, and Hannah Dershowitz is HDERSHOWITZ at aclu-sc.org. She told me earlier that she's related to Alan Dershowitz by marriage, and knows him has worked in his shop up at Harvard Law School. So if you forgot how to spell her last name, just look up Alan. And then the last thing.
On her website.
It's on the website, too, the ACLU Southern California website. And the last thing I've been asked to tell you is that we will have the video of all this on our website, lwvlosangeles.org, and a DVD can be made available on request. So thank you all again for being here. Let's remember the lessons we've learned and try to apply them in the real world. Thank you again.